The fragrance of rosemary lingered in the air, dinner preparation, but tonight, its familiar comfort brought no solace. This kitchen, often a place where Mark and I were together, felt like a stage. I was about to make my grand confession. Guilt had become a heavy costume I could no longer bear. Sunlight slanted through the window, spotlighting my trembling hands. They had held him, traced the lines on his face, loved him. Yet, they had also held another, and the shame of that burned like acid. Mark was a good man, kind and trustworthy. Had he been blind to my discontent? I thought of the daily small compromises that, over time, eroded my happiness. Abandoned hobbies, suffocated dreams neatly packed away. The timer alarm rang, painfully loud. Our dog, Rusty, tilted his head, an innocent creature in this stage of deceit. It wasn't fair to him, to Mark, and most of all, to the woman I was supposed to be. He deserved better. I deserved better. Nausea washed over me. Recently, this was a familiar feeling, not morning sickness but the sickness of lying. The constant beeping of the timer became a countdown to an explosion. Not the rosemary chicken, but the truth bomb I carried. "Darling, I'm home." Mark's voice, clear, filled with an easy confidence I envied in the man I had betrayed. Guilt morphed into a terrible certainty. I had to tell him. Mark entered, carrying a briefcase and a loosened tie. He leaned in for a familiar kiss, and I recoiled as if burned. His always open face now clouded with confusion. "Hey, what's wrong?" His tone was gentle, caring, driving the dagger deeper into my heart. Words fought their way out. "Mark, I have something to tell you. It's important." My voice was a whisper, a pathetic echo of the strong woman I imagined myself to be. He straightened slightly, tension lightly etching his shoulders. "Okay, sit down. Is everything all right?" His concern nearly broke me. Fear of what was next was my only anchor. "No," I choked out, "everything is very wrong." He stepped back as if bracing for the blow he knew was coming. "Wrong how?" I sat down, knees nearly buckling, and the rest of my life played out before me like a ghastly lightning strike. Mark, bent and heartbroken. Disapproving looks from family. The whispered judgments of neighbors and friends. It was all inevitable, richly deserved. "There's someone else, Mark." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The room seemed to spin slightly, the scent of rosemary now tainted with the sourness of betrayal. Mark stared at me, skepticism turning into something harder, colder. The furrow between his brows deepened. "Someone else?" His voice was steady, devoid of its former warmth. Silence choked us. The only sound was Rusty's soft whining under the table, sensing change as dogs often do. I wanted to go to Mark, to apologize, to explain, but I was frozen in place by the weight of his wounded look. "How long?" His voice was tight, and the question hung between us like a whip crack. Tears threatened, but I forced them back. I wouldn't cry, I didn't deserve release. "A few months." The number echoed my shame. Mark turned abruptly, walking to the window. Broad shoulders slumped, head bowed. The familiar silhouette of my husband suddenly seemed alien, the figure of a man hollowed out by my betrayal. "Why?" One word carried more pain than any outburst could. It was the question I had ceaselessly asked myself. My voice broke with the pitiful answer, "I don't know." No reason, no justification. An empty ache settled in me, not regret, but something worse. I was no longer a wife worthy of explanation, just of judgment. Hours passed in disjointed speech and choked silence. Mark moved numbly, starting dinner preparations then abandoning them for strong drink. The discarded dishes reflected the disintegration of our carefully built life. Rusty touched my hand, seeking comfort, but I had none for either of us. Sleep, my usual refuge, eluded me. I lay in bed beside a cold, utterly empty Mark. The silence was a relentless condemnation. The next day, we existed as ghosts in our own home. Mark left for work, jaw clenched, his usual warmth replaced by a cold stoicism. The silence between us now was a formidable presence, making our interactions stiff and formal. Rumors spread with maddening speed. A glance from my favorite barista, silent whispers in the supermarket. The shame, a burden I had borne alone, now publicly humiliated. One night, Mark exploded. "How could you?" It was not a question but an accusation, his fury scorching the room. I flinched at the venom in his eyes. I wanted to scream back, to explain the loneliness, the emptiness, but those words seemed hollow and feeble before the reality of his acute pain. That night he slept on the couch, an unspoken decree about the fracture of our marriage. I cried into my pillow, tears of inexcusable sorrow. It seemed this was the beginning of learning it the hard way. Weeks turned into a strained civility and sleepless nights. Mark and I became characters living in the same space but in separate universes defined by sorrow. One evening, amid the wreckage of our shared takeout dinner, he finally spoke. "Pack your things?" His voice was even, a stark contrast to the accusatory tone before. But I heard something fleeting, perhaps fatigue? Words fell apart, reflecting my shattered state of being. "I think it might be better?" He slowly nodded. "Yeah. Maybe it is." The lack of fight in his voice cut deeper than any heated argument. The following days blurred into a storm of cardboard boxes and remaining belongings. I parceled my heart, focusing on the logistics to dismantle our life together. Each box I sealed tightened the knot in my chest. Our home transformed from haven to crime scene, each shared item now dust-laden with memories. The climax of this terrible ordeal came when I was looking through our wedding album. Its leather cover burned in my hands. Looking back at those pages, we were young and full of hope. In their eyes, I saw nothing of the woman who had shattered their world. Tears blurred the smiles that had frozen over time. A sob escaped me, an expression of the utter devastation I had caused. "I am so sorry," was all I could muster, a pitiful whisper before the vast desolation. Mark knelt before me, his eyes finally reflecting something other than anger. It was regret mixed with a bit of resigned understanding. I know. It wasn't forgiveness but a beginning, a sign that his deep pain might, someday, be a distant horizon. The moving truck became a cruel symbol of a broken covenant. As it drove away, I felt something in me change. It wasn't relief but the acceptance of the difficult burden ahead. A journey through the unforgiving eyes of my own. The apartment I found was small, functional. No cozy window for a rosemary plant to thrive, no kitchen filled with laughter. It was a suitable place for a woman starting from emotional rubble. The first night alone was brutal. Mark's absence, both the hurt and his presence, echoed louder than the empty silence. Weeks passed. I walked alone, the city's noise a sad soundtrack to my inner exile. News of our separation spread throughout our social circle, carrying whispers and judgments as expected. Shame clung to my shadow like a malicious companion. Yet, gradually, something else emerged beneath the weight of it all. A challenging beginning. I had caused this pain, and I would survive it. I took a job waiting tables, a humbling lesson in humility. My once carefully manicured nails snagged and broke on trays and hurried orders. Each interaction burned a new scar of guilt into me, reminding me that I had earned this. This marked a turning point. The climax had passed, a chaotic, brutal story. Now, the resolution began. My punishment wasn't Mark's wrath or the pity my friends might have. My punishment was living in full understanding of the pain I had caused, facing the woman I had allowed myself to become. Months passed in monotonous similarity. My life was defined by long work shifts, aching muscles, and the minor kindnesses of strangers who knew nothing of my burden. I saw other couples, laughing together, sharing intimate moments that I now saw from a new but painful perspective. Each interaction underscored the consequences of my actions. However, the shame and self-blame I expected did not entirely crush me. Instead, a stubborn resilience began to sprout among the weeds of self-accusation. My once carefully manicured world was a harsh, grim reality, but somehow, in its very reality, I was finding something raw and true. One rainy night, an elderly woman left me a stack of books along with a generous tip. "Sometimes, a good story is better than advice," was all she said. Back in my cramped apartment, I reached for one, its pages soft from use. It was a novel filled with stories of broken women navigating through their own rubble. I read until morning, tears mixing with the sound of rain tapping on the window. The stories did not absolve me, but they revealed something I lacked, the understanding that collapse might precede the rise if we make the conscious choice to stand up. A change began to take root. Subtle, a quiet shift from self-punishment to understanding why I had so terribly lost my way. I reached out to a therapist, an idea once terrifying, now a necessary step. Sessions were exhausting, peeling away layers of dissatisfaction, missed signals, and the self I had been too blind to see. A year passed. I remained a waitress, but the pain of it had gradually become acceptance. My apartment had gained a few plants, evidence of a budding desire to nurture. I even began writing again, rusty lines on an old notebook, lines aching with honesty rather than self-pity. News reached me that Mark had started dating again. It was a sharp pain, but only fleeting. I wished him all the best, with surprising sincerity. My journey was far from over, but there was still a light ahead untainted by the frequent tinge of guilt. One evening, leaving work, I chanced upon a familiar figure. It was Mark, a woman in his arms. Our eyes met. There was a recognition of shared history, but now something else defined us. No resentment, no lingering accusations. He nodded slightly. "You look well." A simple statement but laden with the weight of understanding from a great distance. I managed a smile. "You too, Mark." We went our separate ways, moving away from the rubble of the past towards distant, undefined futures. The road ahead was mine to build, brick by painful brick. For the first time in a long while, I believed I could do it. The following year brought changes born from hard-won acceptance. I enrolled in a few community college classes, a step back to dreams I had long shelved. My writing, once a source of self-pitying release, turned into raw discoveries. I wouldn't call it good, but I felt it, necessary. Therapists shifted from dissecting my past to focusing on building a healthier future. The term, boundaries, once foreign, became a guiding star for me. I mended damaged friendships due to my selfishness and cautiously began forming new ones. It was slow, hesitant, but promising. I also stumbled. Loneliness tormented on nights when old regrets seemed too comforting to resist. But the next morning, I tried to stand up, determined that this pain would not define me. One gloomy afternoon, a handwritten envelope arrived. No return address, just my name. Inside, I found a small watercolor painting of a rosemary branch taking root in a new pot. Beneath it, in Mark's familiar handwriting, a simple message. Hope grows in surprising places. Tears fell, but this time differently. Gratitude mixed with lingering pain, a bittersweet acknowledgement of how far I had come. 2 years after stepping out that door, I landed a part-time job at a bookstore, the smell of old paper and new beginnings like a balm to a healing soul. My life was no longer the comfortable existence I once took for granted, but it was richer. I was wiser, scarred by my mistakes but no longer in agony over them. One Saturday, as I was stocking shelves, I noticed a head of blonde hair. My heart startled. It was the woman I had seen with Mark on that rainy night. She was alone, browsing, the quiet focus on her face strangely familiar. Gathering all the courage I had learned from hard lessons, I approached her. "Excuse me, do I know you? Have we met before?" A surprised look, then recognition dawned on her face. "I think so, yes. Outside that diner, not long ago?" Her voice was hesitant but kind. "I just wanted to say Thank you, my voice broke with emotion. For the books you left behind. They meant a lot. She smiled, a genuine warmth radiating from her. I'm glad. I've always believed in the power of the right book at the right time. We talked for a long time. Her name was Sarah, a teacher who had recently gone through a divorce. She recounted her own rebuilding journey as honestly as I did mine. In that musty little bookstore, surrounded by stories of human mistakes and resilience, an unexpected friendship took root. The road ahead remained uncertain, but now I saw the strength in my own hands to shape it. The conclusion to my story wasn't a neat resolution or a happily ever after. It was messier, more real. Forgiveness from others, the hardest thing for myself, might still only be flickering lights in the distance. Yet, among the ruins of the life I had shattered, I was piecing together a new existence. More flawed, more humble, but entirely my own. 3 years passed in a rhythm built on a foundation of hard-won resilience. The chasm of guilt that once yawned wide had shrunk to a bearable pain, a constant reminder rather than an oppressive presence. My life held a quiet satisfaction amidst its difficult edges. My writing evolved. A local writing group offered both critical feedback and an unexpectedly close friendship. I impulsively sent a short story to a local magazine. The acceptance letter came as a small miracle, a validation that the voice I had almost silenced finally had something to offer the world. A hesitant knock on my door interrupted my editing one chilly autumn afternoon. My heart raced, echoes of past fears. But opening the door, I found a teenager, his demeanor a mix of awkwardness and resolve. Hi, you don't know me. I'm Ben, Mark's son. My breath caught. Of course, Mark had a son. A life I had lost access to the moment I stepped out that door. Mark's son? I repeated, more a question than a greeting. He nodded. Yeah. Dad never talked about, you. But Sarah said I should find you if I wanted. Said you might understand some things. A wave of complex emotions washed over me. Shame, regret. But also a fierce curiosity about this boy, a living consequence of my actions. Come in, Ben. Would you like something to drink? He followed me into the kitchen, my small apartment suddenly feeling inadequate. Ben was tall, lanky, with a face markedly resembling Mark's in his younger days. He hesitated before blurting out, I hate her. His bluntness took my breath away. You hate Sarah? Yeah. Dad thinks she's great. But she's not my mom. She'll never be. His voice cracked with a raw hurt that brought tears to my eyes. A wave of empathy washed over me, a mirror reflecting my feelings for another woman. We talked for hours. The carefully built barriers I had erected crumbled. I made no excuses for myself, but I shared my story, the dissatisfaction, the loneliness, the terrible mistakes. Ben listened without judgment, his initial hostility gradually shifting into something more complex. I get it, he finally conceded. Adults mess up too. It sucks being stuck in the fallout. Leaving, he hesitated. I haven't forgiven you or anything. But maybe it was good, to hear your side. The ripples of my past actions stretched out over years, creating new pains I could never have anticipated. Yet, in this messy connection with Ben, among our shared wounds, a strange kind of healing began, not the absolution I didn't deserve, but perhaps a path to a less lonely life. Weeks turned into months. My connection with Ben grew with an uncomfortable honesty. Occasionally, he'd show up unannounced, a whirlwind of teenage energy enveloping him. We'd order pizza, talk about school, movies, and the complicated works of being human, especially for a young person whose life took an unexpected turn. These visits came with a bittersweet melancholy. I saw in Ben fleeting glimpses of the life I might have had, the family I had idealized for so long, and the responsibilities I had recklessly discarded. He never said, Mom, not even hesitantly, and I didn't expect him to. Yet, I discovered I could offer something Sarah couldn't. A space for him to voice his anger and confusion about the break in his own world. News of my temporary ceasefire with Ben reached Mark. A tentative message would become a cautiously polite coffee date. We met in a neutral cafe, the distance between us filled not with accusatory words but the quiet tension of people who had once been close, now almost strangers. "I heard you've been seeing Ben?" His voice carried concern rather than accusation. "Sometimes," was my cautious reply. Sarah suggested. "It's complicated." Mark nodded, stirring his now cold coffee. "I understand. I just want him to be okay. I'm glad you are too." A small olive branch, tentative like a balm to old wounds. Forgiveness was still a distant, elusive maybe, not worth holding hope for. But acceptance, a sliver of it, began to carve a space in this unexpectedly complex dynamic. My writing group flourished. Stories took shape, reflecting the complexity in human relationships, the fragility of love, the weight of regret, and the astonishing resilience found in the cracks of life. My short story was published, garnering more positive attention than I had imagined. An upcoming library reading event stirred an unexpected wave of anxiety. Standing before a modest audience, doubt surged again. But I took a deep breath and began to read, a piece about a woman rebuilding in the aftermath of her own storm. Among the faces, I saw Ben, sitting in the back row, awkward pride flickering in his eyes. Sarah sat beside him, a warm smile on her lips. And surprisingly, in the back, quietly attentive, I saw Mark. The applause that filled me afterward was sweet, but something else felt even more triumphant. The sensation of weaving frayed threads into a new, hopeful, and chaotic tapestry. Another year wove a tapestry of unexpected connections and hesitant growth. My collection of short stories found a small but dedicated readership, with letters from strangers who shared in the brokenness and a glimmer of hope for something new. The success was modest but profoundly meaningful. Ben became a regular part of my life, his visits erasing some of the initial awkwardness. We still clashed, our stubbornness often at odds. Yet now, laughter accompanied the pizza orders. A familial relationship unlikely formed from the shared rubble in which we both, in different ways, lived. My life remained a patchwork of surprises. My waitressing job continued, a constant reminder of my fall from grace. Sarah and I transitioned from a chance encounter in a bookstore to genuine friends, a relationship formed from the empathy of women who had learned to rebuild their worlds. And with Mark, there was a quiet, strange truce. Our interactions remained tentative but polite, driven by a common goal of providing some stability for Ben. One autumn evening, the three of us sat at the kitchen table helping Ben with his college applications, a scene of domestic normalcy unexpectedly serene. Sarah looked up from a stack of brochures and offered me a forced smile. "Well, this is something I never imagined." "Me neither," I admitted with a light laugh. Mark cleared his throat, an awkward pause hanging in the air. "Listen, I want to apologize. For a long time, I couldn't get past my own pain. Now I understand better, not forgiving what you did, but you weren't a monster. You were lost." His words hung between us, their force stronger for their unusual forthrightness. I found myself not so much seeking forgiveness as simple acknowledgement. "Thank you, Mark," I replied succinctly, not wanting to overstep, but in that simple exchange, a bridge began to be rebuilt. The process was slow, occasionally faltering. Some days, we were like strangers learning each other anew after a natural disaster. Other days, I caught glimpses of the past, easy smiles, shared dreams, everyday comforts. Those echoes brought aches, but now they were tinged more with acceptance than despair. My life was no longer the happily ever after I once craved. It was testament to the consequences of my actions, the wounds I had inflicted on others and on my own soul. The road ahead was less romantic, more real. Late-night writing sessions at my cluttered desk brought inspiration. It was the long, polite conversation with parents at Ben's graduation. It was building a different kind of love with Sarah, a friendship born from hard-fought battles. One evening, years after my first confession, I was at a bustling book signing. The room was filled with strangers and a few familiar faces: Sarah, Ben, and yes, even Mark, a quiet pride in his eyes as he stood back and watched. The pain of the past remained, a scar I would always carry. But the end of my story was not a wreckage. It was about a woman who made terrible mistakes, survived the aftermath, and built a life that, while not perfect, was richer for its imperfections. Time continued its soothing work. Ben went off to college. His visits became a sweeter sorrow than a constant guide. Sarah and I rented a small house together, the rooms not filled with the ghosts of a broken past but with the comfortable chaos of a chosen family. My writing found its rhythm, my success modest but steady. Readers connected with the flawed, hopeful characters in my stories, seeing the humanity reflected from their own lives. I began mentoring younger writers, finding immense satisfaction in nurturing others' voices. One day, a letter caught my eye. The handwriting was somewhat familiar. It was from a prisoner, a woman who had found solace in the honesty of my collection. She wrote about her own regrets, her desire for change, the loneliness of facing the harsh truth within herself. My initial instinct was to pull away, dismiss her, but something compelled me to write back. A correspondence formed. My words were cautious, devoid of false hope or pitying absolution. Yet, I wrote of my own lessons: the unending regret, the difficulty of facing who you had become, the small, painful possibility of change as the only way out of the hole you had dug for yourself. Mark and I navigated life on a probing orbit. We found ourselves drawn together by Ben's milestones: weddings, the birth of a grandchild. In the fleeting moments of shared pride and worry, we saw not just the ghosts of the past but the people we had become. There was warmth but also a hard-won realism. We would never be as we once were, and perhaps that was as it should be. On a sunny afternoon, walking through the park, I spotted a figure on a bench. Age had gently silvered his hair, but Mark's quiet strength was unmistakable. I hesitated, then made my way over. "May I sit?" My voice carried a surprise even to myself. He looked up, a genuine smile warming his face. "Of course. It's a beautiful day." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, simply enjoying the serene surroundings. Eventually, I broke the silence. "You know, your rosemary painting is still in my kitchen." He chuckled. "I wondered if you'd keep it." My gaze was drawn to children playing on swings, their laughter echoing in the gentle breeze. "I read about the workshop for prisoners. Did you help frame it?" A shadow passed over his face. "A few years back, yes. It seemed like a good thing to do." "Yes." I turned back to meet his eyes. "I've been writing to someone inside, a woman." Your suggestion didn't disappoint. Understanding filled his eyes. We sat, sharing nothing more than the fading afternoon light and the unspoken recognition that wounds could scar into markers of growth, not just destruction. My story of infidelity, of its consequences, was not a tale ending with a neat bow. It ended in echoes, in the quiet resonance of a life forever changed. It ended with late-night writing sessions, the comforting weight of friendship, the lingering ache for a life I thought I wanted. It ended with a deep breath before entering a classroom, ready to share lessons about hard falls and even harder climbs. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing my apartment in soft golden light. A half-written manuscript lay on my desk, proof of a story still unfolding. Beside it, a stack of reader and colleague letters provided a quiet satisfaction. My life now was a world built on the rubble of the past. Tonight, I would pack for a journey. Not an escape but a pilgrimage. Back to the city where it all began, back to the rosemary-scented kitchen and the life I had carelessly left behind. It was time to close a circle, to confront the remaining ghosts not with hopes of resolution but with the silent acceptance of a survivor. The house felt different. Smaller, less grand. The scent of rosemary no longer lingered in the air, replaced by the faint aroma of lavender. I walked through the meticulously cared-for rooms, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Everything was familiar yet alien, proof that life continued without me. I found myself in the backyard. A swing lay on the neatly trimmed lawn. I had lost a life with children. Yet, I felt no bitterness or despair. Just an acknowledgement that this was always meant for Mark, perhaps not with Sarah, but with a cozy family life that was never truly my calling. The next morning I drove to the cemetery. The marker was simple, bearing the names of Mark's parents, whom I had dearly loved. I placed a sprig of rosemary at the base, not an apology but an acknowledgement of connection, both beautiful and broken. Whispering a gentle goodbye, I felt a weight lift, not entirely, but enough. My visit to Mark's new place was filled with trepidation. Sarah opened the door, her surprise turning into a welcoming smile. We began to chat comfortably over cups of tea, an intimacy forged in shared struggle. Mark arrived, looking more at ease, more at home than I remembered him. We engaged in light conversation, the underlying tension finally dissolving. Before I left, he walked me to my car. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice deep and sincere. My reply was simple. "Thank you for living your life." Driving away from their suburban enclave, a distinctly unfamiliar wave washed over me. My life was now here. The road stretched ahead, promising not a fairy tale ending but a real one. My story was not about neat redemption but about finding strength from the very breakage I caused and the courage to keep building a life worth the hard-won survival. The sun set behind the horizon, casting my apartment in a gentle golden glow. A manuscript half written on my desk, evidence of an ongoing story. Beside it, a pile of letters from readers and colleagues brought a quiet sense of fulfillment. My life now was a world built on the ruins of the past. Tonight, I would be packing for a trip. Not an escape, but a pilgrimage. Back to the city where it all started, back to the kitchen scented with rosemary, and the life I had recklessly abandoned. It was time to close a circle, to face the remaining ghosts not with hopes of resolution but with the quiet acceptance of a survivor. The house felt different, smaller, less grandiose. The scent of rosemary no longer lingered in the air, replaced instead by a faint aroma of lavender. I wandered through the meticulously kept rooms, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Everything was familiar yet alien, a testament to a life that had continued without me. I found myself in the backyard. A swing lay on the neatly trimmed lawn, a life with children I had lost. Yet, I felt no bitterness or despair. Just an acknowledgement that this was always meant for Mark, perhaps not with Sarah, but a cozy family life that had never truly been my calling. The next morning I drove to the cemetery. The headstone was simple, bearing the names of Mark's parents, whom I had dearly loved. I placed a sprig of rosemary at its base, not as an apology but as an acknowledgement of connection, both beautiful and broken. Whispering a gentle goodbye, I felt a weight lift, not entirely, but enough. My visit to Mark's new place was fraught with hesitation. Sarah opened the door, her surprise morphing into a welcoming smile. We began to chat comfortably over cups of tea, an intimacy forged in shared struggle. Mark arrived, looking more at ease, more at home than I remembered him. We engaged in light conversation, the underlying tension finally fading away. Before I left, he escorted me to my car. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice deep and sincere. My response was straightforward. "Thank you for living your life." Driving away from their suburban surroundings, a distinctly unfamiliar wave swept through me. My life was now here. The road stretched out ahead, promising not a fairy tale ending but a real one. My story wasn't about neatly packaged redemption but about finding strength from the wreckage I had caused and the courage to continue building a life worth the hard-won survival.